During a wedding, a blind groom suddenly begins to see. When he looks at the bride for the first time, his reaction amazes everyone. Subscribe and comment where you're watching this video from. Eric had always believed that his life was under control. Every detail, every decision, every step forward, meticulously planned, carefully executed. As an architect, his world revolved around precision and vision, both in the figurative and literal sense. He could look at a blank plot of land and imagine the grand structures that would rise there. He could study a blueprint and see beyond the lines, envisioning the final form before a single brick was laid. That evening was supposed to be like any other. A late meeting with investors, the satisfaction of another successful project moving forward, and then a quiet walk home through the city streets. He could have taken a taxi, but he enjoyed walking after a long day, letting the crisp air clear his mind. His phone vibrated in his pocket, a message from his assistant confirming the final approval of the residential complex he had designed. A smile tugged at the corners of his lips as he typed a quick response. It was one of his proudest projects, sleek, modern, yet designed with warmth in mind. A place that would not just house people, but feel like home. As he walked along the dimly lit sidewalk, his mind buzzed with ideas, calculations, the next steps in the process. The world around him was a blur of headlights, neon signs, and distant chatter from bars and cafes. He barely noticed the crosswalk signal turning red as he stepped off the curb. The blinding flash of headlights came first, then the screech of tires, rubber burning against asphalt. A horn blared, someone shouted, and then impact. His body lifted off the ground, the world tilting, spinning in slow motion. He felt weightless for a brief second before slamming onto the pavement. Pain exploded in his skull, in his ribs, his limbs. The sounds around him, rushed footsteps, distant voices, faded, swallowed by an all-encompassing darkness. Then, nothing. Eric's first sensation upon waking was pain. A deep, throbbing ache that pulsed through his skull, making it impossible to think clearly. His limbs felt heavy, as though weighed down by unseen forces. The faint, sterile scent of antiseptic filled his nostrils, mingling with something metallic. Blood? He forced his eyes open, expecting the harsh glow of hospital lights to sting. Nothing. Just darkness. He blinked. Once. Twice. Still nothing. Panic gripped him like a vice, sending a rush of adrenaline through his system. His hands clawed at the bedsheets, his breath coming fast and uneven. "Mr. Carter, please stay calm." The voice was unfamiliar, soothing, yet professional. A woman's voice? A nurse? A doctor? He turned his head towards the sound instinctively, though it made no difference. "What?" His voice was hoarse, his throat raw. He swallowed, struggling to steady himself. "Why can't I see?" A pause, a hesitation. "We ran several tests," the woman finally said, her tone gentle. "You suffered a traumatic brain injury due to the impact. There was damage to your optic nerve and visual cortex. The blindness. It may be temporary, but we can't say for sure yet." His mind reeled. The words felt distant, surreal, like they were being spoken to someone else. Not to him. Not to Eric Carter, the man who had built a career out of his ability to see what others couldn't. No, this wasn't real. It couldn't be. "I need to see a specialist," he said, his voice sharper now, edged with desperation. "I need a second opinion. There has to be something they can do. Surgery, treatment." "We're doing everything we can," the woman reassured him. "But right now, the best thing you can do is focus on recovery. There's a possibility that your vision will return as the swelling in your brain decreases, but we need time to assess." Time. He didn't have time. His career, his projects, his entire life depended on his ability to see. How could he work? How could he create? A suffocating wave of helplessness crashed over him unlike anything he had ever experienced. He clenched his fists, nails digging into his palms. The darkness around him felt alive, closing in, swallowing him whole. No, he wouldn't accept this. He couldn't accept this. The following days blurred into one another. Hospital sounds became his new reality. The distant beeping of monitors, the murmur of voices outside his room, the rustling of nurses moving around him. At first, he refused to acknowledge the truth. He kept his eyes open for hours, hoping that something, anything, would change. That his vision would suddenly flicker back to life, that the darkness would fade like a bad dream. But it didn't. His friends and colleagues visited, but their voices sounded different now, pitying, cautious. He hated it. Hated the way they spoke to him as if he were fragile, as if he were someone else entirely. His sister, Claire, was the only one who didn't treat him like glass. She sat by his bed, her usual sharp wit cutting through the haze of his thoughts. "Don't give up," she told him firmly. "You're the most stubborn person I know. If anyone can get through this, it's you." He wanted to believe her, but every moment spent in the void of his new reality chipped away at him, leaving him hollow. Then came the doctors. Neurologists, ophthalmologists, an endless cycle of tests, questions, and non-committal answers. "We have to wait and see. There's still hope. We can't make any promises." Empty words. And so Eric withdrew. He stopped talking, stopped engaging with anyone who tried to reach him. What was the point? They didn't understand what he had lost. He wasn't just blind. He was nothing without his vision. But fate wasn't done with him yet. One afternoon, when he had long since stopped expecting visitors, someone new entered his room. He heard the soft click of the door opening, followed by quiet, confident footsteps. And then, a voice, warm, smooth, and steady. "Eric Carter?" He exhaled slowly, turning his head toward the sound. He had no energy for another doctor, another therapist, another well-meaning but ultimately useless conversation. "Who are you?" he muttered. A small pause, then the voice responded. "My name is Nyla," she said, "and I'm here to help." Eric barely acknowledged the woman's presence. He had grown tired of people coming in and out of his hospital room, offering words that meant nothing. Everyone acted as if they could understand what he was going through, but they couldn't. No one could. They still had their sight. They could still wake up every morning and see the world as it was. The woman, Nyla, she had said her name was, did not leave immediately. He heard the faint sound of her stepping closer, the shift of fabric as she likely crossed her arms or adjusted her stance. It was impossible to tell what she was thinking, but her presence alone irritated him. He didn't want company. He wanted to be left alone in the suffocating darkness that had become his existence. "I know you don't want to talk," Nyla finally said, her voice calm and unwavering. "That's fine. I just wanted to introduce myself." Eric clenched his jaw. He had nothing to say. "I work with people who are adjusting to vision loss," she continued. "I'm not a doctor, not a therapist, just someone who's here to help you figure things out. If you want to." Silence stretched between them. Nyla didn't press him for a response, which was unusual. Most people who visited him tried to fill the silence with hopeful reassurances or forced positivity. She simply stood there, unhurried, not expecting anything from him. He wasn't sure if that made him feel more or less irritated. Eventually, after what felt like an eternity, she spoke again. "I'll come back tomorrow." And just like that, she was gone. Eric didn't think about her for the rest of the day. He didn't think about much at all. Thinking led to questions, and questions led to panic, and panic led to more helplessness. He had spent the last few days existing in a cycle of disbelief, anger, and exhaustion. The doctors kept telling him he needed to stay calm, to give his body time to heal. But they weren't the ones trapped in this unrelenting void. Time had become meaningless. He couldn't see the light shift outside his window, couldn't tell morning from night except by the activity around him. Nurses came and went, checking his vitals, asking if he needed anything. He refused most offers of food, eating only when his body screamed for sustenance. The energy to care about anything had long since left him. The worst part was the silence. Before the accident, Eric had never feared silence. He thrived in it. His work required focus, and focus required stillness. But now, silence felt different. It was oppressive, filling the empty spaces where the world used to be. He used to glance out of windows and watch people pass by, used to read expressions, pick up on unspoken emotions in a person's eyes. Now there was only sound, and it wasn't enough. His sister, Claire, had visited earlier that morning. She was the only person he could tolerate for longer than 5 minutes. She didn't try to comfort him with empty words, didn't tell him everything would be okay. Instead, she just talked to him like before, telling him about work, her latest failed attempt at dating, her annoyance with their mother's constant worrying. "Mom thinks you're going to waste away in here," she had said. "She keeps sending me these ridiculous articles about alternative treatments. I told her to calm down, but you know how she is." He had managed a small, humorless smile at that. Their mother had always been dramatic. "You should eat more," Claire had added. "You look like hell." "Can't exactly check," he had muttered. Claire had gone quiet for a second, but then she let out a breath and lightly punched his arm. "Guess I'll just have to tell you then. You look like hell." Her honesty was comforting in a strange way. It was the closest thing to normalcy he had left, but even Claire had to leave eventually. And when she did, the silence returned. Eric didn't sleep much that night. He lay awake for hours, staring into the void, willing himself to see something, anything. He pressed his palms against his closed eyelids, hoping for a flicker of light, a shadow, a shape, but there was nothing, just blackness. By the time the next morning arrived, he was exhausted. He had drifted in and out of a restless sleep, waking up to the sound of doors opening, footsteps, the clinking of medical equipment. And then he heard her again. "Nyla," he muttered, recognizing her presence before she even spoke. "You remember my name?" she said, sounding slightly amused. "I remember voices," he replied flatly. "Not much else I can do." She was quiet for a moment, and he wasn't sure if she was studying him or thinking of her response. "How are you feeling?" "Like I can't see." He expected her to leave after that. He wasn't in the mood for small talk, and most people got the hint quickly when he responded like that. But Nyla didn't leave. "I figured," she said with the same level voice. "So, what's the plan?" Eric frowned. "What?" "The plan," she repeated. "Are you going to sit in here forever, or are you going to start figuring out what comes next?" He almost laughed. "There is no next. I can't work. I can't live on my own. I can't—" He stopped himself. He hadn't meant to say so much. "You can," Nyla said simply. "It's just going to take time and effort." He felt his hands curl into fists. Time and effort. He had spent his entire life believing that anything could be achieved with enough of those two things. But this was different. This wasn't an ambitious project or a career goal. This was his life. and he had lost something that couldn't simply be regained through the perseverance. "I know you don't believe me," she said, as if reading his thoughts. "That's fine. You don't have to, but I'll be here anyway." He didn't respond. He had nothing to say. And once again, after a long silence, Nyla simply said, "I'll come back tomorrow." He lay awake long after she left, thinking about her words. No one had spoken to him like that since the accident. No one had challenged him, pushed him toward something beyond self-pity. But what frustrated him the most wasn't her persistence. It was the fact that, deep down, a part of him wanted to hear her voice again tomorrow. Eric woke up the next morning with an unfamiliar sensation: expectation. It was strange, unsettling even, to feel something other than the weight of loss pressing down on him. He wasn't sure what had changed. Maybe it was the way Nyla had spoken to him the day before, with neither pity nor forced optimism. Maybe it was because she had challenged him instead of coddling him. Or maybe it was because for the first time since the accident, someone had spoken to him as if he were still capable of something. He wasn't sure why it mattered. He didn't even know her. But when he heard the familiar sound of the door opening that morning, followed by the measured rhythm of her footsteps, he realized he had been waiting for it. "Good morning," Nyla said as she entered. He didn't reply immediately. A part of him wanted to act indifferent, to maintain the distance he had carefully built around himself. But he was tired. Tired of pushing people away, tired of pretending he wasn't drowning in the darkness. "Morning," he muttered. She pulled up a chair. He could hear the soft scrape of it against the floor and sat beside his bed. For a moment, there was only silence between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It felt like she was giving him space to speak first. Finally, she said, "Ready to start?" He frowned. "Start what?" "Adjusting," she said simply, "learning to navigate the world differently. I told you yesterday, I'm not a doctor, but I know how to help, if you want it." He hesitated. The idea of adjusting to blindness felt like an admission that it was permanent, that there was no going back to the life he had known. But at the same time, doing nothing was unbearable. The thought of sitting in this hospital bed day after day, waiting for a miracle that might never come, made his skin crawl. "What exactly do you think you can teach me?" he asked, keeping his voice neutral. Nyla didn't miss a beat. How to function, how to move through space, how to rely on your other senses in ways you probably haven't thought about before. Eric exhaled slowly. "Fine, where do we start?" She didn't hesitate. "With your surroundings. Right now, you still think of this room as a blank space, don't you? A void." He hadn't thought of it that way, but she was right. The walls, the bed, the chair, none of it felt real anymore. It all blended into the same shapeless darkness. "You need to start thinking of spaces differently," she continued. "Not as places you see, but as places you feel and hear. Close your eyes." He let out a short, humorless laugh. "I don't need to close my eyes." "You'd be surprised. Close them." He did. "Now, tell me about this room." He frowned. "I already told you. I can't see anything." "You don't have to see it," she said. "Describe it anyway. Where's the bed? Where's the door? Where's the chair I'm sitting in?" He hesitated, then gestured toward the vague direction of the chair. "There." "Lucky guess," she said. "Try again. Listen." He focused. He could hear the subtle shift of her weight as she leaned back slightly, the quiet creak of the chair's frame. The sound was coming from his right. "There," he said again with more certainty. "Good," she said. "And the door?" He thought about it. He had heard it open earlier. The faintest echo of footsteps had bounced off the walls, the sound coming from... He lifted a hand, pointing toward the front left side of the room. "Better," she said. "Now, the bed?" He scoffed. "I'm sitting on it." She laughed, a warm, rich sound. "Fair point. But you get it now, don't you? You can map out a space in your head without seeing it. Your brain already knows how to do this. You just have to trust it." He hated to admit it, but she was right. They continued for a while, Nyla guiding him through different exercises. She had him listen to the subtle hum of the air vent, the direction of voices in the hallway, the soft shuffle of a nurse's shoes passing by the door. It was frustrating at first, but the more he focused, the clearer things became. He began to understand what she meant, how sound, touch, even scent could replace sight in ways he had never considered before. By the time they were done, he felt drained, but it was a different kind of exhaustion than before. It wasn't just fatigue, it was the kind that came with effort. "Not bad for your first day," Nyla said as she stood. He smirked. "So, you'll be back tomorrow?" "Of course," she said, as if there had never been any doubt. As she left, Eric found himself lying back against the pillows, exhaling slowly. For the first time in what felt like forever, he didn't feel entirely lost. Maybe, just maybe, there was still a way forward. Eric hadn't realized how much he had been anticipating Nyla's visits until the day she didn't come. It had been over a week since they started working together, and every morning she arrived at the same time, her presence becoming an unspoken certainty in his new, uncertain world. But today, the door never opened. The hospital sounds around him, the beeping of machines, the occasional rustling of footsteps outside, felt louder in her absence. He told himself it didn't matter. He was fine. He had learned enough already to start adjusting on his own. And yet, the hours stretched endlessly, the silence pressing in on him heavier than before. By the time she finally arrived the next day, he was ready to ignore her. But before he could say anything, she spoke first, her tone as steady as always, but laced with something different. "Sorry, I wasn't here yesterday. I had an emergency with one of my other clients." He didn't ask for details, and she didn't offer any, but for some reason the thought of her helping someone else made him restless. He had grown used to her attention, to the way she focused entirely on him when she was in the room, guiding him through the dark without ever making him feel weak. He had never needed anyone before. He didn't like the idea of depending on her now. Still, they continued as if nothing had changed. She introduced more exercises, helping him distinguish textures with his fingertips, identify objects by weight and shape. He learned to pour himself water without spilling, to use sound to measure distance. The more he accomplished, the more he realized how much he had relied on sight before, how much of the world he had taken for granted. But Nyla never allowed him to dwell on loss. She made him focus on what was possible, what was still within his reach. One afternoon, she took him for a walk outside. The hospital garden was small, but to Eric, it felt impossibly vast. He was used to seeing the world laid out before him, understanding his position in it with a single glance. Now, every step felt uncertain. He heard the crunch of gravel beneath his feet, the rustling of leaves in the breeze, the distant chatter of people walking past. He tightened his grip on Nyla's arm without realizing it. "You're doing fine," she murmured. He wanted to believe her. It became a routine. Every day, she pushed him a little further, testing his limits, making him confront the reality of his new existence. She never treated him like he was fragile, never spoke to him with the hesitant kindness he heard from others. She expected him to adapt, to fight against the darkness, and somehow that expectation kept him from giving up. It wasn't just about relearning basic tasks anymore. It was about trusting himself again, trusting that he could still exist in a world that no longer belonged to him the way it once had. And through it all, Nyla was there, her voice steady, her touch grounding him when everything else felt unstable. The more time they spent together, the more Eric found himself listening for her, recognizing her presence before she even spoke. He memorized the rhythm of her steps, the way she moved with effortless confidence. He could tell when she was smiling just by the sound of her voice, could hear the quiet amusement in the way she laughed at his dry remarks. She never talked much about herself, but in the small moments between lessons, he learned things. That she had been working with visually impaired people for years. That she loved classical music but had a secret appreciation for jazz. That she never liked coffee but always carried a cup of tea with her, the faint scent of chamomile lingering in the air when she sat beside him. One evening, after another walk in the garden, they sat on a bench, the air thick with the scent of fresh rain. He tilted his head slightly, listening to the quiet hum of the city beyond the hospital walls. "You always know exactly what to say," he muttered after a while. Nyla was silent for a moment before responding. "No, I don't. You make it seem like you do." He could almost hear her smile. "That's part of the job." He had never really thought about why she did this, why she spent so much time with people like him, helping them navigate a world that had suddenly turned unfamiliar. He wanted to ask, but something held him back. Maybe he wasn't ready to know. Maybe he was afraid of the answer. Instead, he focused on the sound of her breathing beside him, steady and calm. It was strange, this pull he felt toward her. He had never depended on anyone before. He had spent most of his life building walls around himself, relying only on his own instincts, his own vision. But now, in the darkness, Nyla had become something else, something more than just a guide. And that terrified him. Because for the first time since the accident, he wasn't afraid of being blind. He was afraid of what would happen if she ever stopped showing up. The days blended into each other, marked only by the moments when Nyla arrived and when she left. Eric had long stopped counting the hours between their meetings. Time had shifted, lost its meaning. It was no longer measured by minutes or daylight, but by the steady rhythm of her presence. He knew the exact second she entered the room before she spoke. He could distinguish the way she moved, the way she sighed softly when she settled into a chair, the way she always smelled faintly of chamomile tea. He had memorized her laugh, how it changed depending on whether she was amused or genuinely delighted. It was absurd how much space she had taken up in his mind. Even when she wasn't there, she was still there. Eric had always been a logical man. He had built his life around structure and control, around things that made sense. But this thing that had begun to stir inside him when Nyla was near, was entirely outside of his control. And worse, it didn't make sense. He had never seen her. He didn't know what she looked like. He didn't know if she was beautiful, if she was plain, if she was anything that he would have once considered important. But none of it mattered. He had fallen for the sound of her voice, the weight of her silence, the way she never treated him like he was less than he had been before the accident. He didn't want to acknowledge it. That would make it real, and if it was real, it could be broken. He had lost so much already, his sight, his career, the future he had envisioned. If he admitted to himself that he needed her, that he wanted her, what would happen when she inevitably left? Because she would leave. This wasn't her life. He was just another person she was helping, another case she would move on from once he had learned how to stand on his own again. But even as he told himself that, he felt the truth pressing in on him. He didn't want to stand on his own if it meant standing without her. One evening, they were walking in the park near the hospital, the cool air laced with the distant scent of flowers. He had been discharged a few weeks ago, but still saw her regularly, their meetings becoming less structured and more natural. At first, she had insisted they continue working on his orientation skills, helping him navigate the world with confidence. But lately, their time together had become something else. They talked more than they trained. They sat on park benches, listening to the sounds of life moving around them. He found himself asking questions about her, wanting to know more than just the practicalities of their sessions. Tonight, she had been quiet. He could hear the subtle change in her breathing, the way her footsteps slowed just slightly. Something was on her mind. "You're distracted," he said. She let out a soft chuckle. "That obvious?" "To me, yes." She hesitated, then sighed. "I was thinking about how different things have been lately. With you." His heart skipped a beat. "How so?" There was a pause, long enough that he thought she might not answer. Then, softly, she said, "When we started this, I told myself I was just doing my job, helping you learn. But somewhere along the way, I stopped seeing you as a client." His fingers twitched at his sides. "And now?" "And now?" Another silence. Then she laughed, nervous, hesitant. "I don't know. I just know that I don't think of you as someone I'm supposed to be guiding anymore." He swallowed, his throat dry. He wanted to say something, to tell her that he felt the same, that he had been fighting against this for weeks and losing miserably, but the words wouldn't come. She must have mistaken his silence for discomfort because she quickly added, "Sorry, I shouldn't have said that. I don't want to make things weird." His instincts kicked in before his fear could stop him. He reached for her, fingers brushing against the sleeve of her coat before gripping it lightly. "Nyla." She inhaled sharply. "I don't think of you as my guide anymore either." The air between them shifted, heavy with the weight of everything they weren't saying. She exhaled, her voice quieter now. "Then what am I?" He let out a breath, something between a laugh and a sigh. "I'm still trying to figure that out." But they both knew the answer. Neither of them needed to say it. It was there, in the way his hand lingered on her sleeve, in the way she didn't pull away, in the way the silence between them didn't feel empty anymore. That night, when he lay in bed, he let himself replay the moment over and over, memorizing every detail. And for the first time since the accident, the darkness didn't feel so lonely. Eric had always been a man of precision. Before the accident, he lived by carefully laid out plans, by blueprints and measured decisions. He knew how to anticipate, how to adjust, how to mold reality to fit the vision in his mind. But love had never been something he planned for. Love, by its very nature, was unpredictable. And falling in love with Nyla had been the most unplanned thing that had ever happened to him. In the weeks following their quiet confession, nothing between them had changed, yet everything had. They never labeled what was growing between them, never spoke about it directly, but it was there in the way she lingered after their sessions, in the way their silences stretched long and comfortable, in the way his hand always seemed to find hers when they walked. It was in the way her voice softened when she said his name, in the way his pulse quickened whenever she was near. For the first time in his life, Eric wasn't afraid of the unknown. He wasn't afraid of what came next, because as long as Nyla was beside him, it didn't matter. He didn't need to see her to know that she had become his constant, his anchor, the one thing he had been certain of in a world that had otherwise unraveled around him. And that certainty led him to a decision that should have terrified him but, instead, felt like the only logical step forward. He was going to ask her to marry him. The idea had formed slowly, creeping into his mind in quiet moments, when she laughed at something he said, when he reached for her hand and she didn't hesitate, when he imagined a future and realized she was in every version of it. At first, he had dismissed it as foolishness. They hadn't even talked about what they were, about what they meant to each other. But he didn't need a conversation to know the truth. He loved her. And he knew, with a certainty that rivaled anything he had ever built, that he didn't want a life where she wasn't a part of it. He had never picked out a ring before. Before the accident, he might have wandered into a jewelry store, studied the displays, examined every diamond under bright lights before making a decision. But now, he had to rely on someone else's eyes. Claire was the obvious choice. His sister had always been the one person he trusted implicitly, and when he told her his plan, she had gone suspiciously quiet on the phone before finally saying, "You're serious?" "Yes," he had said simply. A long pause, then a sigh. "Well, it's about time." Claire had taken him to a small jewelry shop a few days later, describing the rings to him in a way that made him both appreciate and curse her bluntness. "This one is delicate, kind of vintage-looking. This one is flashier, big diamond in the center, very dramatic. This one, oh, I think this is the one. It's simple but elegant. A small solitaire, but the band has this really subtle design, like vines wrapping around it. It feels like something Nyla would wear." He ran his fingers over the band, tracing the design. It was smooth, timeless, understated. It felt right. "This one," he said without hesitation. Claire had hummed in approval. "Good choice, little brother. I think she'll love it." If only proposing were as simple as choosing a ring. He wanted to do it right. He wanted it to be something she would remember, something she would know he had put thought into. But he also didn't want anything grand or excessive. That wasn't them. Their relationship had never been about big, flashy gestures. It had been built in quiet moments, in whispered conversations, and laughter shared in hospital rooms and city parks. And so, he decided to take her back to the park where everything had changed, where she had first admitted that he wasn't just another person she was guiding. The air was crisp that evening, the scent of damp earth and blooming flowers surrounding them. Nyla had been laughing at something he had said, her fingers brushing against his in that casual, effortless way she always did now. And then he stopped walking. She must have sensed something in his stillness, because she turned toward him, her voice softer now. "Eric?" His heart pounded. He had prepared a speech, had rehearsed a dozen different ways to say it. But now, standing here with her, everything he had practiced felt unnecessary. "I want to spend the rest of my life with you." The words came out quieter than he intended, but they carried more weight than anything he had ever spoken before. He felt her breath hitch, felt the way her fingers tightened slightly around his. "Nyla," he continued, reaching into his pocket and pulling out the ring, holding it out toward her even though he couldn't see her reaction. "Will you marry me?" For a long, agonizing second she didn't say anything, and then he heard a soft, shaky laugh, a breathless, disbelieving sound. "Oh, Eric!" Something wet landed on his hand. A tear. He felt her fingers brush against the ring, then against his face, tracing the line of his jaw as if grounding herself in the moment. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes. 1,000 times. Yes." Relief flooded through him so suddenly that he almost laughed. He slid the ring onto her finger, feeling the delicate metal settle into place. And then, before he could overthink it, he reached for her, pulling her close. She fit perfectly against him as if she had always belonged there. She pulled back slightly, and he could hear the smile in her voice when she teased, "You sure about this? You've never even seen my face." His lips twitched into a smirk. "You could be an ogre, for all I know." She gasped in mock offense. "Wow." He laughed, shaking his head. "It doesn't matter what you look like, Nyla. I see you, and you're the most beautiful thing that's ever happened to me." She didn't say anything after that, just pressed her forehead against his, her breath warm against his skin. In that moment, Eric realized that for the first time since the accident, he wasn't thinking about what he had lost. He was thinking about everything he had gained. The day of the wedding arrived with an overwhelming sense of anticipation. Eric had never been a man to believe in fate or miracles, but as he stood at the altar waiting for Nyla, he couldn't shake the feeling that everything in his life had led to this moment. It was surreal, the idea that he was here, in a place he couldn't see, surrounded by people whose faces existed only in his memory, about to marry a woman he had never laid eyes on. And yet he had never been more certain of anything in his life. The morning had been a blur of preparations. Claire had been in and out of his dressing room making sure his suit was perfect, making sarcastic remarks about his tie being crooked, even though he had no way of confirming it. His best man, Marcus, had tried to keep him relaxed, joking about how he never thought Eric would be the first among their friends to settle down. There had been the usual nerves, the last-minute chaos that always seemed to accompany weddings, but through it all, Eric had felt oddly calm. Because today wasn't about the details. It wasn't about the flowers or the music or whether the ceremony started on time. It was about Nyla. The guests had settled into their seats, the air buzzing with hushed excitement. He could hear the shifting of fabric, the quiet murmurs of conversation, the occasional laughter of someone trying to keep their emotions in check. And then, suddenly, everything stilled. The music changed. His breath caught. She was here. He couldn't see her, but he could feel her presence. He could hear the faint rustling of her dress as she stepped forward, the soft gasps from the guests as they caught their first glimpse of her. He imagined her walking down the aisle. Imagined the way her fingers might tremble as she held her bouquet. Imagined the quiet, steady determination in her expression. His hands clenched at his sides, not out of fear, but out of a desperate longing to reach for her, to hold on to the one thing in his life that had never wavered. And then, something shifted. At first, it was barely noticeable. A flicker, a fleeting sensation like the distant memory of light. He blinked, unsure if his mind was playing tricks on him. But then, it happened again. A vague disturbance in the darkness, a subtle shift in perception. He couldn't make sense of it, couldn't grasp what was happening, but something inside him whispered that this was real. His pulse pounded. He squeezed his eyes shut, then opened them again. And then, colors. Not clear images, not full shapes, but something. A haze of warmth, a mixture of light and shadow where before there had been only void. His breathing hitched. He focused harder, willing the blur to sharpen, willing his brain to make sense of what his body was trying to tell him. As Nyla drew closer, the haze grew stronger. He could make out movement, the suggestion of form. He couldn't see details, couldn't truly see in the way he once had. But there was something undeniable about the way the world was beginning to take shape again. And then, suddenly, she was in front of him. His chest tightened. His hands trembled as he reached forward, hesitant, almost afraid that if he touched her, she might disappear. The room around them fell away. He heard someone sniffle quietly in the crowd, heard Claire's sharp intake of breath, but he couldn't focus on anything except the woman standing before him. Nyla. He could see her, not perfectly, not clearly, but enough. Enough to make out the soft curve of her face, the depth of her dark eyes, the way her hair framed her features in elegant waves. Enough to know that she was even more beautiful than he had ever dared to imagine. Tears blurred his vision, but he didn't care. He reached for her face, tracing the lines of her cheek, the gentle slope of her nose, the full curve of her lips. His fingers had memorized her before his eyes ever had, but now he could put the pieces together. Nyla, he whispered, his voice barely audible. She sucked in a sharp breath. Eric. Her voice trembled as if she wasn't sure whether to believe what was happening. He let out a shaky laugh, his thumb brushing against her cheek. I see you. A choked sob escaped her lips, and then she was crying, her hands coming up to grip his wrists as if she needed to hold on to him just as desperately as he needed to hold on to her. The guests had fallen completely silent. No one spoke. No one moved. It was as if the entire world had paused, holding its breath for this moment. And then, finally, the officiant cleared his throat, his voice thick with emotion. Well, he said with an almost reverent chuckle, it seems we have a miracle in our midst. Shall we continue? The laughter that followed was light, breathless, full of disbelief and joy. Nyla was still gripping his hands, as if afraid that if she let go, the moment would slip away. But Eric wasn't afraid. Not anymore. They turned to face the officiant, the rest of the world slowly coming back into focus. The vows were spoken, each word filled with a depth of meaning that neither of them could have prepared for. When it was time to say, I do, his voice was stronger than it had ever been. And when the officiant finally announced them husband and wife, when Nyla threw her arms around his neck and pressed her lips to his, Eric knew with absolute certainty that he had been wrong about fate all those years. Because fate had led him here, to her, and he would never take it for granted again. The wedding celebration stretched into the night, filled with laughter, music, and the warm embrace of family and friends. Eric held onto Nyla's hand as if afraid she might slip away, as if the entire evening was too perfect to be real. But it was real. She was real. The world around him was real. He could see, not fully, not as he once had, but enough. Enough to know that he was no longer lost in the void. Enough to watch Nyla's face light up when she laughed, enough to catch glimpses of the way her dress flowed as they danced. It wasn't perfect clarity, but it was more than he had ever dared to hope for. The guests toasted to them, their voices filled with awe and wonder. His sister Claire, ever the realist, made a joke about how Eric had always been stubborn enough to defy the odds. But beneath her sarcasm, he could hear the emotion in her voice. She had never stopped believing in him, even when he had stopped believing in himself. At some point during the night, Nyla pulled him aside, away from the crowd, to a quieter part of the venue. The air was cool, the stars scattered across the sky in a way he could only partially perceive. She squeezed his hands, her fingers warm against his. "You're really seeing this, aren't you?" she murmured, studying him as if searching for reassurance. He exhaled, his thumb running over her wrist. "Not perfectly, but I see you." Tears shimmered in her eyes. He had imagined this moment before, imagined what she might look like, wondered about the softness of her features, the depth of her gaze. And now he had the answer. She was beautiful, not just in appearance, but in everything that made her her. She laughed softly, shaking her head. "I don't even know what to say. This shouldn't be possible." He smiled. "Neither should us meeting in the first place." She breathed out a quiet laugh, stepping closer. "Fate, huh?" "Something like that." They stayed like that for a long time, simply holding each other in the quiet, away from the curious stares of the guests who were still marveling at the day's events. For all the joy in the room, this was the moment that mattered the most. Just them. Just the certainty of what they had built together. A few days later, Eric sat in a neurologist's office, Nyla's hand resting in his as the doctor reviewed the latest test results. The words sounded clinical, filled with medical terminology about neuroplasticity, brain swelling, and the unexpected ways the human body sometimes healed itself. But all Eric truly needed to hear was the conclusion. "You've experienced a rare but documented phenomenon," the doctor said, flipping through his notes. "Your brain has been slowly rerouting visual information. It's not perfect, and your vision may never be what it once was, but it's clear that your brain has been adapting. There's even a chance that, with time, it could improve further." Nyla squeezed his hand. "So, it's not temporary?" The doctor hesitated. "We can't say anything with absolute certainty, but given the progress we've seen, I'd say it's more likely than not that you'll continue to adjust." Eric let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He wasn't sure why he had been so afraid of hearing that answer. Maybe because it meant accepting that he truly was healing, that the life he had thought was lost wasn't just returning, it was evolving into something new. On the way out of the office, Nyla was quiet, not in a distant way, but in a way that made him feel like she was thinking about something important. He could sense it in the way she held onto his arm, the way her fingers traced small circles against his skin. When they stepped outside, he stopped, turning toward her. "What is it?" She smiled, tilting her head up at him. "I was just thinking, if you had never lost your sight, we never would have met." He considered that for a moment. It was true. Before the accident, their paths never would have crossed. He had been a man so consumed by his work, by his own structured way of living, that he wouldn't have noticed the woman who had become his entire world. If he hadn't lost his vision, he wouldn't have found her. And if given the choice now, he would lose it all over again just to have her. He cupped her face, his thumb brushing against her cheek. "I used to think that losing my sight was the worst thing that could have happened to me." She leaned into his touch, her breath warm against his skin. "And now?" He smiled, pressing a soft kiss to her forehead. "Now I see that it was the best thing." She let out a quiet laugh, wrapping her arms around him. "That was a terrible pun." "I know," he murmured against her hair, pulling her closer. As they stood there, wrapped in each other, the past no longer mattered. The future was uncertain, but that didn't scare him anymore. Because whatever came next, they would face it together. And, for the first time in his life, Eric Carter wasn't afraid of the unknown. He welcomed it. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss more like it. Share this video with others who might love it too. And, if you want more, check out the next one on your screen.